This policy meeting will come to order. We will say the pledge. I'm leading tonight, if that's okay with the board. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to our first policy committee meeting of the new year, and have a few items to go over. Mr. McLeod, we'll let you have the floor.
Okay, we'll start with number 1 on the agenda as policy 5.501, complaints and grievances. And I highlighted on the second page for you the portion that we are proposing to remove from this policy. Some of you who've been on the board for a while will remember several years back, we actually removed this section from the policy. It was prior to the TSBA overhaul we did. I think what happened, the best I can figure, is it was in our sexual harassment, bullying, intimidation policy, and we took it out of that policy, but it apparently inadvertently got in this policy, which was a TSBA policy at the time, and it just came to our attention recently, so I put it on the agenda to try to make it consistent with what we've done in the past. And the reason we did that, for folks that aren't here, those appeals were coming to the board on employees, and the board doesn't really have any avenue with respect to disciplining employees. So we just felt like there was really no reason for that to come here. It's the director that has the authority to handle those situations anyway. So that would be the reason to take that out.
I remember we had, years ago, a lot of conversation about having a policy that we had no authority in. So, so glad to get that cleaned up. Any questions for Ms. McLeod? Hearing none, your recommendation is to delete this portion. Okay.
Move to adopt this, Chairman.
Okay. Mr. Holliday. Second by Dr. Washington. Any questions or comments? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, good.
Number 2 on the agenda is policy 6.600, student records. And this is the policy we've had on 2 previous agendas and have gone over so that everybody would have ample opportunity to look over it. The reason we recommended changing this policy initially was because in going through the policies, we recognized that our policy was very different from TSBA's model policy where this was concerned. So I brought it to you just to say ours is very different. You want to take a look at theirs and see if it's something that we want to be consistent with. The language that's highlighted in the copy that I gave you is what is in the TSBA policy and not in our policy. It comes straight from the Federal Education Rights and Privacy Act.
Their policy does, or our policy?
Their policy.
Their policy.
Just to clarify and add to this information, we are required to put in our student handbook every year. So identical information is in the student handbook, and has been for several years. Our recommendation would be to approve the TSC policy.
Give everybody a little bit more time to peruse it if they would like. If anyone has any comments or questions of Ms. McLeod or Mr. Reed?
We're just moving this language verbatim into our policy. Okay. This is pretty standard stuff, isn't it? I mean, about
They just straight out
transfer of records and who can look and who can't and stuff like that. Okay.
and notifying parents as to when they can have and
Okay.
can't have.
Move for adoption, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Ms. Franklin, second. Questions or comments? That's a good point. Okay.
It's the most common name.
Yep.
It is.
Thank you, Ms. That's why we have so many eyes to look at this. So, good. Okay. We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Motion carries.
Is policy 4.602, grade point average and class rank. What you have in your packet is, if you'll remember, Ms. Jordan Fullerton came to speak to you several months ago about adding some criteria to graduating with distinction. So I have her letter for you on top, a copy of the state rule regarding graduation with distinction after that, and then our current policy is the next page after that. So after some discussion, Mr. Oden and I discussed today, and I tried to contact Christy Bauer at the state as well with her interpretation, but haven't been able to get in touch with her. It appears in my reading of the rule that under number 1, graduation with honors, state honors, and state distinction, under number 1, it's possible that a local district could create categories for distinction locally, but if you look at number 3 that talks about state distinction, it appears to me in reading it that only those criteria will apply to graduating with state distinction. So I'm not sure that there's even an option to add categories to that portion.
Now, is this state school board regulations, or is this statutory?
Board of Education.
State Board of Education regulations, okay.
So I tried to, get in touch with her to get another interpretation of it, but I haven't been able to get in touch with her prior to the meeting. But Commissioner Oakwood, I would read it the same way. It seems pretty clear to me that that's the criteria for state distinction, that we might come up with our own if we chose to.
When the state board passed this, it was interesting.
They even passed it out 4 years ahead. You had to notify students to do it. It was for the freshmen, and when they graduated to do it. So the process for implementing this was kind of lengthy to do that. So the intention was that it was fairly tight to what it had to be. But some districts create their own at some point. But I'm not sure the way I read this, if you do that, you're going to have to create your own category. But you could have the Rutherford County distinction, but I don't think you can call it state distinction. I don't think we have the power to add to their criteria to do that.
Start that process.
You'd have to do your Rutherford County distinction to do that.
Criteria and begin it with the beginning of the class.
Do we have any,
Some schools do some, within their individual schools, they have some things like that.
and that's just automatically allowed? There's really not anything for the board to?
And it's sometimes it's organizations or certain members, they wear cards, you may be,
Right.
certain clubs, organizations like that.
However we work this out, could we contact Ms. Fullerton and, explain to her that, that we don't have the opportunity to change state regulations that, that we might consider?
You read it the same way we do? Kind of what I.
Do we possibly have an understanding of all state athletes, and by what designation are they sanctioned? Yeah, how is an all-state athlete determined?
And I asked that same thing too. I looked at Mr. Tackett, he was in a meeting this morning, but,
Is it only for TSSAA sports to do that? What about the,
Sports Writers Association usually does the all-state.
is it only for TSSAA sports that they would pick from?
That's all that I'm familiar with.
See, swimming's not a TSSAA sport. I'm just saying it.
I don't think it's an
kind of a
all-state,
slope to-
excuse me, I'm sorry, Mr. Director, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I don't think it's an all-state swimming team. I could be wrong about that, but I don't believe so.
Right,
That's correct.
and that's in regulations too.
The reason I asked the question is, we do have a provision in here that if you have a nationally recognized industry certification,
Yeah.
a little bit of a stretch, but if we considered athletics an industry, and if the Tennessee Sports Writers Association was a nationally recognized organization, then could we consider all-state designation as a certification from a nationally recognized organization?
I've only known the industry part to be CTE, basically.
That's the certification of the
Yeah, that's CTE.
The reason I bring it up is because I certainly understand the argument that's being put forward by the students here. If a band student gets provision of being recognized all-state, why then an athlete not?
Who's selection that?
For the all-state band, they go to a tryout, there's tryouts for all-state band.
And Tennessee Sports Writers, and Mr. Tollett's exactly correct about that, and there have been in the past AP and I think other organizations, but they're in no way are they affiliated with the TSSAA or with Rutherford County or any school system. And they are essentially naming our students, if we're lucky enough to have one, and as all of you are aware, Rutherford County is just, we have plenty of them. But they're not named by the school system. We got all county teams and things of that nature, but we, all state is exactly that. It is named by, in this case, Tennessee Sports Writers. I don't know. We may be digging into an area here where we don't have really any authority, and my all-state team might be different from yours.
How could your all-state team be different than mine? I mean, isn't there just one all-state team?
Well, I mean, if we,
But not everyone has a vote for sports writers. It's my understanding that Tennessee Sports Writers Association, if you're a sports writer, you get a vote for the all-state team, and then they make it. So like, that's who decides who the all-state team is. Right. And there's a different one for classification, Class A, AA, AAA. But likewise, there's an organization that's selected among band directors that sit and adjudicate whether or not you're an all-state band member. Everybody doesn't have a vote about that, and it's not something that's determined. I think what I hear is that the jury's still out on a super score. We may or may not be able to interpret that as to whether or not, a super score is officially acknowledged or recognized or reporting issues. We really don't know if we can recognize a super score yet. But I can see a reason that in Rutherford County, we could interpret the Tennessee Sports Writers Association as a nationally recognized organization, athletics as an industry, and consider that a certification. I would certainly be able to argue that to the State Board of Education and say, really? Why is that not the case?
Then would our next endeavor be to actually inquire?
I think so. I don't know if Mr. Holliday and I disagree or not, but I'll say this, I agree with him on this. If we can do it, I'd like to do it.
Well, and I think that Mr. Overton, correct me, maybe Mr. Dago, but there's a difference between ACG composite score and the ACG super score. And what this says is composite.
Okay.
So, I mean,
Maybe that resolves that
Right.
issue. I still think maybe for athletes, and might even be inclined to say, tell me I'm wrong. We've got some seniors who would like the distinction. Somebody come and challenge that an all-state athlete is not just as deserving as an all-state band member.
So, I mean, we can certainly hold it over. I have sent the email to inquire, I just haven't got an answer back, so.
Well, I'm seeing a lot of heads nod in agreement, so I think, unless I hear otherwise, Dr. Washington?
You might want to include that also.
Two governor schools.
Governor school, that's not the same thing?
No.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know state boards, why they chose those
These
discussion that
categories.
went on. I mean, it's probably been 6 years ago now, at least, maybe 7, since they first announced it.
In different schools have different chords for honoring students. Okay, I know there's a lot that are consistent, like National Honor Society. I think you have the collar and you know, we certainly see a lot of graduations, and we see a lot of students with different colored, cords. So every school has some different, distinguished,
So is the proper thing for us to do to defer this to the next policy meeting? Is that
I don't.
we need to do?
A motion and a premise.
Well, I'll just add that to the inquiry. I mean, I think, if I'm correct, there's a difference between the composite score, which is the criteria, and the super score.
I just wanted to throw this out
Yeah.
there, just because I'm a ACT test supervisor. The way that the super score that I understand it works is if a student has taken it 2 or 3 times and they just need to improve that math score. The thing that I really worried about when I was asking Dr. Washington before the meeting, as a Smyrna High School, if one of our students takes the test, when does that count for us? When does that count for Smyrna High? When does that count for the county? If that student just needs to improve the math score, that student has the option to go in on Saturday morning, take the first 2 tests, and leave. Now, that is a terrible composite score. If that counts for my school, that's not good. And that's not good for Rutherford County. But the student gets what he needs.
The state report card, I think, does not consider super scores at all. I think your reporting from the state as far as school districts and schools is that composite score that they get in the ACT.
That's the thing. That student's composite score that day is awful. And I've been told that we take the highest composite for that student, and I've been told we take the last composite for that student. And I will just share that scares me.
What did you say, Mr. Charles?
It's the last, recorded for the school, my understanding is the last score they take. The state, even if they come in just for a,
Right. So if they
just what
make
she's
a
saying,
23 on the English and a 30 on the math and go home, they have an awful composite score.
Yeah,
And that's what counts for
But
us.
they only took 2 for
Because they only do two. And they can do that.
The other
We also
thing that,
talked about, you know, it's possible that a student could take the ACT multiple times and we
Yes.
wouldn't know the score necessarily.
and I mean, you might pass the deadline for notification of distinction to get it on your graduation, and they haven't reported it to you. You know, so, I mean, I could see where guidance counselor being the state test we get, you know, but I'm not sure, it's their choice whether they want to make you aware or not.
On our state report card, if that student just came in to improve that super score and has a really low composite, and the last one is what counts for us, that's
That's what
bad
you
for
get.
Rutherford County. That's bad for us.
But we did talk about being difficult to track.
You know, that's something which is like, we could send an email to the
I just
state
wrote the question
and
down.
find out when they compile the report.
I'll be texting
what it
you
is.
this afternoon, sooner or later tonight.
We want it in writing. What is the state using?
Yeah.
Well, they should know.
Because it's, I know, and I've been told several different things. So,
That would be bad for us to
That
do
would be
using
horrible.
just
The last.
portions, yeah, okay.
And they only took a portion of it.
Okay.
If all they need to improve is English, they can just take the English and leave.
I'm the students, I wonder, actually take it twice, I don't guess it's, or more than twice, or, I don't guess there's any way for us to really know that is.
I would say at our school, we probably have 70% of our students take it 3 or more times.
They tend to do better the second
Mhm.
time.
They do.
Well, I think maybe I would take it once, just to get the experience of taking it the second
Well,
time.
of course, they have to take it in
They have to
school.
take it.
They have to take it
Right.
here. But, so we have, I would say most of our students take at least 3.
It's a smart thing to do.
Yes.
From the student standpoint.
So do we need a motion or?
I know, we should
We're
defer.
just gonna defer?
Okay, and then the last one on the agenda is 4.401, textbooks. The top page you have there, the first page, 2 pages are the draft that we are presenting.
Then you have a copy of our current policy, and then you have a copy of an email from Ms. Moore making some proposed changes. Essentially, in the draft that you have, that we're presenting, put some specific criteria for application process, percentages of each category that would be on the committee. And this is another one Mr. Oak and I discussed today that perhaps get some feedback on if Mr. Reed's opinion. It concerns me a little bit that by adding specific criteria to the parent section of that, we would be sort of going against the intent of the law because that criteria is not set out in the statute. So, and how you hear how Jeff feels about it, but I'm a little bit concerned about adding criteria to it that's not set out in the statute.
You talking about, for instance, where I have recommended criteria as far as educational background and so on?
Yeah.
Okay, I can understand that.
So, I mean, in looking at, you know, you have to kind of look at what the intent of the law was, and if that criteria wasn't there, you know, did the legislature really intend for it to be that broad category, or if they intend for it to be more specific, you know, why is that language not there? So, and again, I've sent some questions about that, but I haven't gotten any answers back. And I'm not sure how Jeff feels about
Yeah, I
that.
don't know.
The statute just says a broad category of parents that have children enrolled in our school without it setting out any specific criteria for that.
Yeah, I think you could adopt some like criteria internally within the school system if you wanted to, say this is people we would like to have on our committee.
So that, I mean, what Ms. Moore's suggesting is that we have some educational and experience criteria
Right.
for the parent group.
Which makes sense, you know, because you want qualified parents to be on the committee.
Well, and I just think, again, if it does look like you've revised the policy where it's going to open it up, as I have requested, at least have an announcement to the public made so other parents have, that may not necessarily be connected with the PTO or whatever, but that are really interested in serving in this capacity, would at least have the opportunity to know about it and to, so to speak, throw their hat in the ring. But in the event that you do wind up getting more candidates than you have room for, I think you've got to have some kind of criteria established to narrow down that field. And again, with, you know, all due respect for our principals and the folks that did this last go-round, I understand they know their parents, but again, if you think about it, if we get candidates from, that do have kids in the school system, but perhaps the principal, those administrators don't know, you know, what kind of criteria are we going to use to narrow down as to who the best candidates are? I mean, to me, this is really, in essence, you know, the same as interviewing a candidate for a job. If you've got more candidates than you have job openings for, you've got to have criteria established for what's going to drive the decision as to who the best people for those spots are.
I don't really see that as conflicting with statute. The statute does not really say you cannot establish criteria to appoint parents to the committee. But it's just a broad category, we want parents on the committee in general. So I think the school system chooses to appoint parents based on some criteria the school system creates itself. I don't know that that's going to be conflicting with the statute as it currently reads.
Would that actually be in the policy, the criteria, or is that just kind of like an administrative thing?
Of course, you don't, in the scheme of things, you don't want the criteria to exclude parents who would be qualified candidates to sit in that position. So you do want to have a fair set of criteria.
Sure. Well, I mean, that category just says parent, and you put educational experience, you're excluding an entire group. I mean, that narrows that group greatly.
Well, and what I had recommended was, minimum of a high school diploma with college preferred. In other words, that would be one of those deferral points if you are having to narrow down the field of the candidates,
Right.
which I don't think is overly restrictive. And to me, it would make sense that if you're going to, appoint a parent to help review a textbook, that a high school education would be, I think, not beyond the realm of unacceptable. So.
Sure. Right. Yeah, I think a minimum of high school diploma, I think certainly is something that should be considered.
I'm hesitant to extend it, though, beyond a high school diploma, only because that's the guideline and requirement for an elected school board member. And so a higher standard than what we're held to, although it seems logical, I don't necessarily find that it's appropriate in policy. And I don't want to automatically give written distinction that says that if a parent happens to be a college graduate, has a master's degree, and et cetera, well, we have to accept them, even though everybody knows they're a thorn in the process, or a fly in the ointment.
Well, again, and that's certainly just one of the criteria. I mean, because that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be the top candidate either.
But it would be one of the only, if not the only, written criteria. We would have discretion and this one written criteria. And how would we say that discretion outweighed this written empirical criteria?
How much difficulty do you have getting parents, Dr. Washington? You serve on that. I mean,
We call principals and we ask them if they have someone they wanted to recommend. We really didn't have a problem getting parents. But I was wondering here where it says principals in consultation shall submit up to 2 persons. So will all parents come from the principal's recommendation? And do we ask all principals? I talked with the coordinator, so we were wondering, did this mean every principal could submit up to 2 names?
That'd be 92.
Well, I didn't,
Yeah,
you say
it's all
principals,
grades.
but when you say principals shall submit the name, how many principals? How do you choose which principal? We didn't know how to interpret that.
Dr. Washington, I was kind of looking at the same thing myself, because it really is kind of ambiguous, because up above it says 2 nominees based, well, it says, let me see, if I can here just a moment. Shall be, textbook adoption committee nomination shall be posted on the Rutherford County Schools website at least 30 days prior to the committee nominations being presented to the board for review and approval. So it really kind of leaves a big gap there that I think kind of ties in with as you get further down, the principal and the PTO organization. Well, how does it get from the website interest and the word nomination to me is confusing. That still doesn't tell a parent if it gets posted, well, I have the opportunity to submit my letter of intent or my application or whatever that I'd like to be a part of this. And then, then where does it go from there as to where it winds up with the principals? And also, clarifying how many. Absolutely.
The middle school people had difficulty getting parents this time, wasn't it?
County's Leadership Academy that we're wanted to narrow down to 30 and ended up having 38, but we had about 108 applicants. It took 3 of us a full day to go through each one of those. It took Ms. Barnes, Mr. Duke, and myself a day to go through that, plus it took Ms. Drake, my secretary, approximately 3 days to file all that, get all that paperwork together for us. So if we start talking about 200, 300, 400, what does that do to the staff time? That's fine. Do we have the staff to go through that number of names? It took us basically 6 Band-Aids to narrow down 108 to 38.
I guess I'm a little confused on that point because we're talking about with asking the principals for the recommendations and we didn't even get enough candidates. So are you concerned that we're going to go from one extreme to the other, from not having enough viable candidates or people that are willing to having way too many?
I am concerned if we require every school to send 2, or if we open it up, for example, a second publication or it open to the public and have the public recommend that. If we have 150, 200 names that we need to contact and review their application to see if they meet the state law criteria, that'll take a tremendous amount of time to go through that, to do that.
Well, and I think that the state law criteria, and I understand your point, the state law criteria for the parent applicants is just essentially that they have a child in the school system in that age group, correct? Like, for instance, if we're reviewing middle school math books, and I'm a parent wanting to apply, I have to have a child in middle school, in the Rutherford County system.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
You're correct, but we're starting to add to that by saying they have to have a high school diploma. Do we have them send them a copy of their diploma to prove that they're that way or not, and we
Right.
go through that? So when we start adding additional criteria to that, that starts having to be additional pieces of paper that we have to review in order to see if they meet our criteria as well.
Right. Well, the criteria that I've recommended, I don't think is overly burdensome. You know, again, what I've suggested in that they have to either fill out an application or write some letter of intent, that it could be clearly spelled out on the website's announcement that in order to be considered, they have to submit a letter of intent or what have you that includes ABC. And that if it doesn't, the application won't be considered. I mean, I certainly don't think that's in any way discriminatory. I would certainly think that that would help narrow down the ones that are just, which I think may kind of be your concern, the ones that are saying, oh, I want to do that, but then it's kind of like, it's like the whole job application thing again. And I know I keep using that analogy, but it's like somebody looks at that job on Career Builder, it's like, oh, I think I'd like to apply for that, but when they get in and find out it's one of these companies that has a very, very detailed application process that's going to take them an hour, it's like, I'll forget it, you know, and they move on. So I think that would take care of itself, but.
The notification would actually would direct the parent to apply to their principal for nomination. Is that not correct? Okay, that when it was published or announced that we would ask those parents to come to their principal to be nominated by their principal to sit on the committee.
So they would just be directed to do that as opposed to applying through central office or
I wouldn't think
curriculum?
you want to apply to central office. It'd be
You're still going to make a number of them happy. So,
Well, what we'd be asking is for the principals or administrators to submit, but it may be that they don't have those individuals so it might not be that many. I mean, if history proves.
Tollett to see what he thinks about that, but I don't think Mr. Tollett, once he sets that criteria, is going to submit a pair of names that would not meet that criteria. So I think we would have 92 valid candidates.
So I'm saying that we would make it mandatory for an administrator to submit. It's just if no one applied to that administrator, then you may have so may not have that many applicants.
So you really have some unknown factors here, really not knowing, once we do publish it, what the response is going to be or look like. But again, the criteria, even if we just say high school education, I mean, that's pretty broad. And let's say they do get a lot to look at, those principals. Yeah, I understand that they're going to have to narrow it down, but if it becomes too cumbersome, I mean, is it something that we could look at so as not to have to abuse the staff's time and everything, that perhaps there could even be a committee of board members to review if we do wind up having an overabundance of those applications? I mean, to me, that would be a good thing, that you had that many parents interested in playing a part in reviewing their children's textbooks, and I don't know if that's something that can be considered or not.
I would think anyone that was interested in serving is going to put their best effort to prove their education, their knowledge. If they're interested in serving, they're going to try to make sure that they accentuate the positives. So as far as the administrators, I don't think that'll be a difficulty. I think trying to pick.
ESL parents that may not have a diploma that could possibly be there, or some other parents that may have been disenfranchised in education for whatever reason, you know, and not receive a high school diploma, do we say GED equivalents? Those are some other considerations. If you start ruling out some people that may have been disenfranchised by public education in their lifetime, we want to break that cycle, and that's what we work hard at in instruction, is to keep students of parents that may not have had that education, to make sure they get that education too. And the more of those we can bring in, it may be better for us. Just a thought.
Let me ask a question. Bring this down to something that maybe a little bit easier to deal with. One of the many subjects, many areas of math that we're going to be adopting this next year will be, I assume, a new Algebra 1 textbook. Is that correct? Yes, sir. Okay. And it's it'll have a usage of 6 years. Yes, okay, that's normally taught on the freshman level or sophomore level?
8th grade.
Well, okay. All right. Okay. So when we decide to do that, our schools, wherever the Algebra 1 book will be used, is each one of those schools going to send a teacher, or will there be just 3 or 4 teachers, or?
At least 50%. You know, the
Okay.
reason for
It does say that here, 50%. So Mr. Tollett, who's he's a guy I always call if I want to know anything. He can, or maybe not, have an Algebra 1 teacher on this committee. I guess if he wants to, I guess he can have one. Yeah, I mean, absolutely.
In middle and high, we try to include somebody from every school, because we want them to take the sample copies, and we used to get sample copies, that's kind of changing too, back in their building and tell others, come by, look at it, give me your feedback, then come back so that you're representing lots of people. The problem we have now in elementary, we now have 25 schools, and so your situations you begin to run into now is
Big committee.
the committee can get beyond what's you need, you know.
Right. Even if you only had 50%.
And you gotta have experts added to that and parents added to that under the statutes. So, I mean, at least parents, so it could get really large. So that was why the thought was at least 50%, what it should say.
The two groups of people that I I guess one of them would probably be just one person, and then the other one would be teachers. I would want teachers, as many as possible, even if we're 26 maybe, and I realize that's a lot. I understand that. High schools now would be 8 or 10. And then I would want the curriculum person from this office who knows what's required and knows what the state is going to want us to do. And those are the yes, and I would want them to be absolutely have a huge impact on what textbook is selected. That's fairly easy for us to do, but the selection of parents or perhaps others is not quite as easy. I don't know how. I just don't see how we can make it much fairer than we have. Now maybe we don't. I don't know this now, so you're gonna have to help me out. But I don't know how good a job we do with publicizing and letting each school know, every PTO know that. And what do you do if I volunteered, let's say, for the social studies book for next year for American history, which would be one of maybe 4 or 5 subjects that I think I could really do, okay? And then the principal, for whatever reason, decided that Mr. Jordan is just not suitable for this committee and didn't recommend me. Well, then what do I do? Am I out in the cold then at that point? Or I guess I am, aren't I? And I'm not sure that's good or bad. I was just thinking about how inept I would be with what Mr. Estes taught. I mean, I could volunteer for that committee too, and I know nothing about it.
Another thing, when you start naming every school though, just other than make correction if I'm wrong, have we added 11 schools in the last 2 years?
Yeah, that's about right.
So we've added 11 schools in 10 years.
I voted for all of them.
What will it look like 2 years from now? We're writing policy for the future as well.
You know, and let me say this too. There's not going to be another textbook committee appointed anytime soon. The next one, you've got your math, which is the one now. The next adoption is CTE textbooks, I think, which comes next year. I don't know what's going to be, how many parents and all are going to be interested in that, but we need to get some parents on it, very definitely. But I'm just saying, this is not something that that you're in a rush to. If you want more time to think about it, we got to decide tonight what all has to go in this, because it's not going to happen anytime soon. You're next fall, at least.
Is it possible, I guess it is, surely, that if a board member wanted to come to one of these meetings, which I assume are held right here, it's probably in this building, could we not come by and say, well, we'd like to see some of the books you're considering for whatever subject?
You're welcome to any of those things, and we would appreciate you visiting and spending time. We invited Ms. Moore before, when she was one of our parents, to spend some time there as well. But there are not always, as a matter of fact, most of the time they are not here. What we try to do is hold them at a school so that it's convenient for teachers sometimes, or so that we can have those materials at that school. Storage space in this place, in what I call the White House, is not the best.
Our last meeting was at Miller's Grocery. I enjoyed that great deal. Well, I put that out.
That sounds like a great place.
It was a wonderful meeting, yes.
Since we've had quite a bit of discussion and a point that Mr. Odom just made, since we're not really under any time constraint to do this immediately, would the committee want to consider postponing this and take it up again at our next policy meeting, which they seem to be coming, 3 and 4 times a year rather than just once a year, like it was in the past or a couple of times. Would the committee want to entertain tabling this for a while and then coming back and revisiting it after we've had some more time to think and ask questions?
You know, I would think, and of course, I hate to ask for things to be postponed, certainly it's not necessary, but given all the conversation that we've had here tonight and all the different kind of thoughts and ideas, I think in this particular situation, it probably would behoove us to do that, because that way we all have the time to kind of walk away with what we've talked about tonight and put some more thought into it, and I think then that would make the next meeting a lot more productive.
What we do sometimes also is we design an administrative procedure to apply your policy, because sometimes policies can get so lengthy, they become confusing. So for principals and others, very often when you pass a policy, we have to come back up here and try to write an administrative procedure how to apply that. And I don't know, this may be one of those cases where you may want to have some very specific things in the policy about percentages of parents or something like that, but you may want to deal with administrative procedures, which doesn't take 3 readings and stuff like that to deal with.
The majority of things that we're discussing here are really more procedural.
I agree.
One of the things when we did the TSBA review, they said, put your basic guidelines in the policy, your operating procedures will be what you put the specific components in. And all of this is really more procedural than it is policy.
It might be helpful to have someone from the administration walk through how you, as an administrator, would understand the process would work overall, from beginning to end, with respect to what the committee, how you would envision it working and implemented. So I think it would be helpful.
I think there is a philosophical component of this that does belong in policy, and I'm grateful that it's coming up, that we want to be completely transparent, intentional, and aggressive in asking the community to be a part of that parental influence in this process. I think that belongs in policy. But I think that procedural way of how we get from a principal's recommendation to a board's nomination to a board's approval and appointment, that very likely is a procedural kind of thing. But in the final analysis, I do hope that we come out with something that says we're not just going to have parent participants, we're going to actively solicit parent participants and encourage the community, because if you know nothing about the subject whatsoever, you can take a look at that textbook as a parent and exercise your parental perspective and say, I don't care what you're trying to teach there, that picture's objectionable, or something else. And that's the parent's role in that committee. They may not understand the CTE program that's being taught. They may not understand, that's why the experts are there, that's why the teachers are there, but they understand core values and you know, what the home life is, and they say, man, I know it's a nursing subject, but are you sure we're going to show them that? And that's an appropriate parental perspective.
I was one of the ones that put the 15% in there for parents, and I did basically for this reason, it's for the future too. If you have a committee of 20, you're going to have 3 parents on there to meet that. So, I mean, if you don't have some guideline on how many, is it the token parent or it's others? So that's why I was trying to, you know, to meet the, when you say minimum 15, then you can see, have you got that minimum of 15 or not? I mean, that ensures they're there.
And I think past performance also says that we should ensure via policy of the way that we solicit, promote, and expose our invitation to the parents to be involved. So I think it is appropriate to move this to the next committee meeting.
All right. Well, we have finished. Anything else to come before this committee?
I have something, if I may, and I apologize, I didn't make copies of anything, and I'm not necessarily asking for action, but I want to make the committee aware of something that I watch. Just to start with, Google gives me the option to set up kind of an alert, and so I have an alert that's set up, it's restricted to the United States of America, and it's school board policy. And every morning, it submits to me anything that's being debated on school board policy. It checks the news feed and sends us over. I can't look at it every single day, but I look at it quite often. And some things have come up that have been a concern for me for some time. Originally, I came to the September 2013 Policy Committee meeting and suggested that we may want to take a look at gender specification in our school system. One of the things that was discussed at that time is that if we take some measure, make some policy in response to a current or ongoing conflict or issue, then the courts have traditionally looked at that as a discriminatory act against that particular situation. And essentially what I'm saying is, if we wait until the controversy comes and visits us, our hands are tied because we can't respond to that situation. We have to respond as public schools should respond and plan in a neutral perspective. Currently, we're in a neutral perspective when it comes to gender issues inside of our schools. But I want to make you aware that in the state of Kentucky, there is a high school in the Louisville area that has decided that, and you may have heard this in the media, whichever gender you identify with is the bathroom facility or locker room that you are welcome to go into. That seems controversial to me. So much so that now the Kentucky State Legislature will hear a bill from one of their legislators that says, oh no, we will make a law in the state of Kentucky that says you will only go into the facilities where you are anatomically appropriate to go. So they're going to have a debate about that. It's not just happening in Kentucky, though. In the state of Minnesota, they have a debate where the equivalent of our TSSAA, the athletic board for the state, has stated, voted, and adopted 18-1 on their committee that whichever gender you identify with is the athletic team that you can participate on. And that will be the guidelines for the state of Minnesota. Likewise, the St. Paul School Board, and this was the one that hit me just in the last couple of days, is looking up or looking at a gender inclusion policy. Once again, we are at a place right now where we do not have a debate, and only in that place are we in a position to be able to put something in place for Rutherford County Schools. At the time, in September of 2013, I suggested that we should put it in policy because we have an enrollment procedure that allows for a student to be enrolled with a birth certificate. And that birth certificate has on it a medical distinction of their gender. Likewise, we have a school, a student assignment policy where we say that we as a school board we reserve the right to assign students to specific circumstances and situations because we have to keep control of this whole environment. Through the school admissions policy, 6.203, and the student assignment policy, 6.205, I believe we have the opportunity to identify that Rutherford County Schools will recognize gender as it is assigned on a birth certificate. Now, full disclosure, let me share with you that I'm trying to keep a good, fair, balanced perspective on this issue. And the American Medical Association this summer adopted a policy to examine when, where, and under what circumstances medically a doctor would reassign gender on a birth certificate. Currently, the American Medical Association only allows that when a surgical procedure has taken place. But they're not sure in the day and age that we're in today, where hormone replacement therapy and such as this is so prevalent, if that's the right designation. They haven't made a change there, but they are examining that. We would still be in a strong position with a policy that said, whatever's on that birth certificate, that's what we'll take a look at. We're not medical professionals. We'll look there. If the medical community chooses to change their criteria then perhaps we would be inclined to follow along. But I think there's an opportunity for us, and it may be an opportunity that is getting away from us as more and more of this debate is decided across the country, where it's appropriate for us to reflect the will of our community and the peace and tranquility of our educational environment, and place some line in our policy. That's a delicate thing for us to discuss, but I would so appreciate anyone who has the courage to meet me at this hour and discuss it with me in this committee.
Can I just say, being in a school every day, and I don't know if you've seen this too, we are on the edge. We have had in our school several students who would walk into the wrong bathroom, and when we correct them, they want to argue, and it's only going to take one parent. We're there because they identify. And so that's just where I stand. We're on the edge.
Certainly, our board attorney is going to be prevalent in discussing this, and this, like you said, it is certainly delicate, and we want to be thorough, and I certainly, if we want to have more discussion tonight, that's fine. We certainly want Mr. Reed and Ms. McLeod involved, and certainly wouldn't want to make a decision tonight on something that, especially it's not on the agenda, but.
Yeah, I would just say it's an ongoing issue throughout the nation. It's an emerging issue. It continues to evolve. We don't have clear guidance with respect to some of these issues that you get involved with in the Supreme Court. In relation to these matters, Supreme Court's taking up issues of gay marriage and stuff like that now. So the whole issue and the whole world we live in legally is evolving with respect to these types of issues. We do have to be sensitive about constitutional rights and make sure we don't violate the rights of students that could expose us to liability for claims for damages and so forth as well. So it's not an easy answer, it's not a quick answer. So it's something we can look into and see what we want to do, what we can do to address it in a manner which would minimize the risk of litigation against the school system.
Yeah, I could see potential litigation coming either direction from that one. I'm curious, do you know, Aaron, if has there been any case precedents in terms of either policy or even lawsuits in the state of Tennessee yet? Or do we know if there are any other school systems in this state that are taking a position on it, or?
There are school systems that have modified their non-discriminatory policy to include gender, and even gender identification, gender or gender identification. We have seen that terminology at the policy committee level in the past, and we have chosen to adhere to what is currently the federal guideline that says that we do not discriminate based on race, religion, ethnic background, or any other reason. And that is sufficient language because it reflects what the federal guideline is. Did I say that about right, attorneys? Okay, correct.
There's not any Tennessee litigation in Tennessee that I'm aware of. Some other districts that I have.
They're both right, though. It's gonna happen. And then maybe tomorrow, it may be next year.
It's really something the state legislature should take up, and that's the level it should be addressed, and that's the appropriate level for it to be addressed. Because state law, they want to make a law identifying people by gender based on their birth certificate. At that point, that's an issue that the state can defend it, there's lawsuits arising from it, and you keep the local boards of education from having to spend thousands of dollars defending and litigating these matters. So it's really a state issue
will take litigation for the state to take up such a hot topic. They will not step up. In the meantime, our school system will be subject to adhering to the lowest common denominator. We will be subject to the precedent of what other systems are doing, and we can look in the coverage here and see where other systems are going. We'll watch Kentucky and we'll think about that. But in the meantime, we are essentially defenseless right now because we have no standard. We really don't have, everything is a case-by-case basis. When we have a case-by-case basis, are we actually opening ourselves even to more opportunity for a misstep because we're depending on a teacher or a building administrator or our director of schools to make a decision unadvised? There is a clear distinction on a birth certificate, which is a document that we require for admissions into school. I think it's an easily defendable stand to acknowledge. It's a medical designation. We're interested in medical circumstances and medical conditions that we should acknowledge in taking care of that student. We're not interested in being an instrument of social change. We are only interested in educating and acknowledging medical circumstances.
We'll be having another policy meeting here with the things we covered tonight and with what Mr. Holliday has brought before us too. So Mr. Reed and Ms. McLeod will have some work to do, and we'll bring back a recommendation also. Anything else? Again, thank you for everybody's participation, and we stand adjourned.